Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Heart of America on YouTube. We are a program that aims to try to bring to the fore deeper conversations, not so polarized, perhaps looking at more of the root factors involved in some of the deep divisions we see in the United States and even around the globe. If we can get to those deeper causes, I think that we have a better chance of finding real solutions. And today I have two very special guests. I will introduce them in a minute. But the topic for today is about a great divide, not necessarily a left-right divide, but the income gap. The fact of increasing concentrations of wealth in the hands of a smaller percentage of people, at least in the United States. We have one guest from England today, so she may be able to speak to that a little bit. I'm not sure what's happening in England around that, or even globally. And Michael, I'd be interested in asking you if you know anything about the global situation. But in the United States, we are looking at an incredible concentration of wealth in the hands of billionaires and now trillionaires who actually are, some of them are paying little to no taxes back into the system. Some corporations have paid like no taxes. Netflix, for example, I remember, I believe it was in 2017 or 2018 was reported as paying no taxes at all. And we know, since most of us binge watch Netflix, we know they're making good money. And so what are the consequences of this concentration of wealth? What are the consequences of people, in a way, hoarding wealth, if we could call it that? And so my guests today are Michael Mechanic. He is a senior editor at Mother Jones magazine, also the author of this new book out from Simon & Schuster. It's called Jackpot: How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. He is zooming in from his home, I believe, in Oakland or Berkeley.
Oakland, yeah.
Oakland. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. And then we also have Chantal Burns with us. And Chantal Burns, I'm going to get to her bio here. Just give me a second because I want to read it out. Is the founder of the Conscious Leadership School based in England, but I believe that this work goes into the United States as well. And she helps people to learn how to identify and remove the mental interference that gets in the way of leading with compassion, resilience, and clarity. Oh, how much do we need this right now? Chantal also mentors practitioners and coaches and is author of the best-selling Pearson book, Instant Motivation: The Surprising Truth Behind What Really Drives Top Performance. And she's currently completing her second book, which is on psychological resilience in the face of the many issues we're dealing with today. I know she's also active around climate mitigation and adaptation measures in her hometown. Her new book will be coming out also from Pearson. When does that book come out, Chantal? What's the scheduled release date?
Early next year.
Early next year. Okay. So thank you two for coming on. And we're going to be talking about something that is a topic that is so much at the root, I think, of the many issues that we're facing globally around climate and species extinction, as well as in the United States around the income gap and income disparity. I'll just start, Michael. I'm going to ask you a question first. But we both actually came up together as journalists writing for a local alternative weekly paper where we used to have desks facing one another. So when he came out with this book, I was pretty excited to interview him, get him on my radio show, and then also get him on this channel. And in Santa Cruz and also in the city probably where Michael lives, which is, did you say Berkeley or Oakland? I forget.
Oakland.
Oakland, also in Berkeley, everywhere in the Bay Area and everywhere, I think, around the country is my guess. We literally now have shanty towns. And in fact, they're in some ways worse than shanty towns because a lot of shanty towns there's a sense of permanence to a shanty town where you could at least feel somewhat stable in terrible living conditions, but know you have a shanty to go home to that will be there when you come home from whatever work you're trying to do or whatever you're doing to survive during the day. We have shanty towns that aren't even permanent, and they are growing in the United States. I think a lot of people around the world who haven't been visiting here lately would be shocked to see how much we have started to look like a country that is not taking care of its residents and citizens properly. We look at Europe, we look at especially the Nordic countries. I've been reading this book, Happy as a Dane. You can see how much I read and research things by all the Post-it notes in this book about how Danish people living in Denmark have an extremely high level of well-being and satisfaction in life, and they are taxed at tremendously high rates. It's something like a 50% tax rate after you're earning about $60,000 US. That may have changed a little bit. This was written a few years ago. But Michael, what do you see as, in doing so much research for this book, and he also interviewed very wealthy people who are owning all of this wealth and talking about what their issues and problems and perspectives are. But just looking at the cultural scene in the United States, the social, cultural, political situation, tell me what you see as damaging. I mean, part of your title is How Their Wealth Harms Us All. And what is damaging about the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few, and the fact that we keep lowering income taxes on the wealthy, at least here in the States? What does this do to our society, would you say?
Well, you held up the book about the Danes, and it's not like Denmark is a society without a wealth gap. I mean, there's a big wealth gap there, but the difference is there's a sense of like collective well-being, and the unions work with management of companies very closely in the Scandinavian countries to make sure people are taken care of. The government, really, the tax is high so it can give back to people who really need help, or, childcare is free, healthcare is free, all these things that just are great for like to have a solid, strong middle class. And what happens when you don't have that and you have this wealth gap is you have a lack of trust. And the people who feel put upon at the bottom, are angry at the people with the wealth, and the wealthy people look down and say, oh, those people are undeserving, or they say, well, the system's unfair, but I didn't make the rules and I'll play by the rules as they are. And the trouble is they say these things, but then they hire wealth managers and lawyers and so forth, whose industries, even if they are not personally lobbying to keep the tax rules as they are, those industries are. And of course, the very wealthy folks, like the billionaires, the people who have what's called a family office.
Yeah.
It's like a separate private company just to manage the family's affairs. I mean, they hire people, and if most of these people are business owners or, have large stakes in businesses, and those businesses are lobbying for these, tax rules to pay the minimum possible and give back the least possible. And I mean, in 2019, there was a lot of uproar about income inequality. And so the Business Roundtable, which represents 350 of the biggest sort of public corporate CEOs, they came out with this statement. They said, we're redefining what a corporation should be. And instead of just catering to shareholders, it should cater to all stakeholders, including the environment, local communities, workers, taking a more holistic view. And everyone's like, that's great, but it sounds like BS from these people, right? Because their actions up to this point have been quite the opposite. And as we see now, with Joe Biden proposing a fairly bold social agenda, that very group is out there lobbying against it. Even they're lobbying against very modest tax increases, including, a 5% bump in capital gains tax rate, but that's the tax rate you pay on investment profits, which is far below the top rate that you pay on wages. So, the notion that we live in an unfair society it keeps being reinforced and reinforced and reinforced. And I think there's a lot of anger,
Yeah. I'm a little angry, especially around climate issues. I mean, as a sort of middle-class person, and I know some very wealthy people who don't mind paying taxes. They're Democrats. They vote for Democrats. I don't know if they believe in everything the Democrats stand for. None of us really do. And I think it's important to speak in terms of these nuances of what we believe in and what we don't believe in. The Democrats are a huge group. But in terms of climate, also as an issue globally, what I see are that, and so correct me if I'm wrong, and Chantal, I'd really love for you to chime in as well, because you and I have done a lot of work on climate. We have a series of videos called Light on the Horizon, where we try to help people with just trying to face the climate crisis with some resiliency and mental health. You can also find that on YouTube. It's a channel. And Chantal, I've worked with you on your Conscious Leadership School. What I see, how can I put something so huge into words? It's almost like, Michael, it's become almost a game. People are trying to hold on to money. Like you say, they may be more compassionate individually, and yet they enter into this game, into the system where profits are king. Profits rule over everything else, it seems like. And so we're bought into a system that we created, and we can't seem to change it because people are into this game. It's almost like any other game, like a video game or Dungeons and Dragons, where you're getting points, and the points are dollars or pounds or euros or whatever you're going for. So Chantal, in terms of climate, what I see also is that the profit motive and almost mandate given our stock market, which I think you can be sued as an executive if you're not maximizing profits for your company. That seems insane to me. Means that the fossil fuel industries are trying to maximize profit. And that means, for example, in the United States, that we're going to bring tar sands, bitumen, crude down through the pipelines, even though it's more heating. It's like 30 times more heating than other kinds of crude oil because of the profit that can be made. And so I know that you've looked at climate quite a bit with me. We don't have a lot of time, if any, to try to turn the ship around. And so it seems to me that looking at this game as something that we created that we could possibly change, looking at, is it making us happy? And that's something that Michael can also speak to in terms of these people's lives. And you can speak to, because you've worked with high net worth individuals. But I know I'm just throwing a lot at you right now. But my question is, what do you see in terms of the climate crisis, the extinction species crisis, and the way people think about money, the way people act around money?
Is that for me, Amy?
Yeah, that's for you. Yep.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the issue we've got coming down the pipeline, if it's not already here, is that, well, first of all, I think there's a fear of there's always a fear of loss of money. I shared the story with you of a client I work with who told me that he's set up and he's lost and created many businesses, and the one thing that he's noticed is when he's got lots of money, he feels insecure. And when he hasn't got any money, he feels insecure. And he's like, what's up? So I've got loads of money, I feel insecure. I lose my business, I still feel insecure. I get more money, I still feel insecure. So that's why he came to see me. It's like, I need some help here because I seem to be insecure whether I've got money or I've not got money. But it beautifully points to the deeper truth, right? About how money is a tool. Money is a tool. It used to be, we used to swap cows for, goats, and money is a tool for trading. Forgive me, I haven't read your book yet, Michael, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. But from my sort of humble perspective, money is a tool to trade. But what has trade got to do with happiness? We've conflated this idea of trading things as having something to do with happiness. Sure, money is important for, it's going to be important to invest in new technologies and new ways of building things like building buildings, for example, to factor in changes in climate. And that's going to need a lot of resource, and part of that resource is going to be money, right? So there are going to be lots of challenges about what, how do we get enough money in local authorities to be able to put into communities, and so the money question is always going to be an issue. But then what I'm almost more concerned about, because I think eventually we're at crunch point now, and so I think that in the conversations we're having with local government, they realise to put a lot more financially into adaptation and transformation of systems and communities generally. But my bigger concern is the profit mandate won't fundamentally change. What will happen is that the greenwashing that's what will take over. So it'll be like, oh, we can create all of this wealth from green technology. Oh, we can create all of this wealth. Don't worry, you might not be able to make loads of money from all of the dirty stuff, but you'll make loads of money from the clean stuff, so we'll clean up the planet and you can get really, really rich. That's brilliant. It's a win-win, isn't it? But we're still locked in the same paradigm of, when we don't understand what the real role of money is, that it's a token, that it's a tool, that it's a symbol, that it allows us to trade. But when we conflate our happiness and well-being with trade, that's where we have a fundamental disconnect. And that's what I'm interested in, the fact that we have an entire system that is in an old, outdated, false paradigm. And
I'd like to chime in on what you said about insecurity, because I just actually edited an article about, there's a guy named Van Baal. He started a group called Follow This that goes around and brings in sort of climate activists, just everyday people, to buy shares in fossil fuel companies. And then they sort of combine those shares into a shareholder resolution. They get enough power so they can introduce a resolution. They pressure the board and other shareholders to vote, to basically hold the companies to certain pledges to align their operations with the Paris Agreement. And one thing he said that was interesting was, in a way, I feel for these guys, these board members and executives, because their whole life they've been doing this one business model, and they don't know anything else. And so when you threaten that, they feel threatened. So I mean, there is something to be said for convincing someone in a way that's not attacking, but it's empathetic. So like, they are human beings. Their insecurity is probably what's driving the wanting to cling to wealth and cling to status and cling to what I've worked my whole life up through these industries, and now I know everything about it. I know how all the pipelines work, and then the logistics. And now these people come in and they tell me they want to change everything, and I don't know anything about this other technology, and so they feel very threatened by it.
Yeah.
And I think you get that just with wealth in general. Like, one of my sources in my book said he had sold a company after he spent like 10 years building up a corporate online learning company, and he sold it, and his chunk of the acquisition was like $40 million. And he said, all of a sudden, my whole attitude went to being fear-based. Now I'm scared of losing this money. It's like completely irrational that he'd be scared of losing it, but he was. And he said, my behavior is now kind of dictated by that fear.
Yeah, I remember that part in your book, or at least in one of our interviews prior, Michael, on Casewood. I just want to chime in here and say that Enbridge, speaking of climate and where these companies are putting their money, Enbridge is a Canadian company that's actually been funding the Minnesota Police Department and police forces from outside of this country to crack down on the protests against their pipeline in the United States, which I'm like, how is this legal or constitutional or any of that? But at the same time, what I've been reading about in looking at who's funding Enbridge is that they are they have been pressured by some of the banks, including Chase and other banks, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, et cetera, to sell off their renewable energy assets in order to have the money to build this pipeline, which is going to contribute to more global heating. And of course, what I think all understand to be coming disaster. I mean, death. I mean, people are dying in Madagascar right now because there's a lengthy drought that's been going on for over a year, and people don't even have food to eat there now. So anyway, and then to me, it's like, well, what does this all boil down to? Who's winning? And how do we define winning? And can we look at winning as something quite different? And we can get into the more spiritual or emotionally intelligent aspects of this in a minute. But just in terms of, Mike, I think a lot of people are interested in your book because people want to know, how do the super wealthy really live? What do they really think? And I think what you found, I mean, I'm not going to say that every super wealthy person is unhappy and stressed out and miserable. I'm not sure if that's true. But I think what you found is that super wealthy people don't necessarily have the market cornered on happiness and well-being. They have their own stresses and concerns and worries. And sometimes there are even significant challenges to their well-being that comes directly from the wealth itself. Do you want to talk a little bit about, could you talk a little bit about, the people you interviewed and what kinds of issues they were facing and problems?
Sure. I mean, your mama told you that money doesn't buy you happiness, right? But we don't really believe that.
Right.
In a way that our society is sort of built around acquisition and hoarding. And we say that, right? But then half of Americans still buy lottery tickets because they want to get the big windfall.
Right.
When you talk to really wealthy folks, you basically see that their problems are just, they're not, they are money related, but they don't have the same money related problems as the rest of us, but they have money related problems. If you don't have enough money, you can be really miserable. I mean, if you have to work 3 jobs and you're scrapping to pay the rent, you're under threat of eviction or foreclosure, and you're in a job you hate. I mean, these things are terrible, and people are very unhappy. And so, if the literature, the scientific literature on self-reported happiness shows that it rises with rising income up to a certain point, and it's a pretty modest point. It's like $65,000, $75,000 a year.
Right.
And beyond that, and then there's sort of different measures. It kind of goes up to about $100,000 a year in what's called life satisfaction. But then beyond that, those measures start to decline. And it's really hard to get, the researchers have trouble getting very wealthy people to participate in their studies. And it's hard to get them to talk to you about wealth.
Yes, you had a hard time. I was,
yeah.
You said that it was hard to get people, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like you have to find friends of friends of friends. And even then you come in with a strong introduction, and most people are like, no, I'll talk to you about anything else, but not that. Because it becomes very personal. In this society, wealth is a very taboo and personal subject. And but some folks were, willing to be very upfront about it. And I think, they, in a way, they like to profess the sort of this version of success, a sort of satisfaction with their success, but they're no happier than the rest of us. And this idea that money will solve your problems is not true. It solves some problems, it creates other ones. And some of those, especially at a high level of wealth, problems of trust between spouses, between children and parents, between members of an extended family, between people and strangers. Somebody approaches you, what do they want? Somebody tries to befriend you, what do they want?
Right.
There's a lot, especially, you get up to hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars, and that really becomes acute. And what happens is people stop trusting outsiders, and they only trust people in that same tier of wealth. And that's really problematic, because then you start existing in this bubble where everybody's got a private jet or is in some private equity fund or has a house in Aspen. And what is really abnormal becomes normal. And you start losing empathy with the people who are not part of that group, because sort of out of sight, out of mind, they're far away from you.
Yeah.
And the people we empathize with, the people who are close, they're in our neighborhood, or the people we work with, or they're close to us in other ways. But we segregate ourselves by wealth. You lose that connection.
Yeah, I
And
want to.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to read a passage from your book, actually, that was very poignant to me, about a woman who lives on the beach in a very fancy home, very wealthy woman. And this was a story, I think, told to you by Richard Watts, who's a consigliere for some of America's richest families. And he's telling the story of, well, you say he tells stories to you of aimless and ungrateful heirs, of philandering husbands, and gold digging spouses, and of a client reduced to tears in her oceanfront mansion at the sight of a group of beachgoers grilling hot dogs below because she could no longer relate. She said to him, "I don't have anything in my life that feels like that. It's always charitable dinners and fancy things. Nobody is there to just share simple pleasures." And then you go on and on in this book talking about, there's a lot of fear of what the masses, quote unquote, will do to the wealthy. They're building bunkers, they're investing in security guards and $1 million security systems, if not more, multi-million-dollar security systems to try to protect themselves. And again, I'm like, geez, is this necessary? I mean, what if we just change the tax code so that there wasn't this huge divide, or really started to share and really look at what we need to fund, preventing complete climate catastrophe and creating adaptation and creating a more equitable and just society. Now, I want to also mention this book, The Golden Ghetto, because this was the first book I read by Jessie O'Neill. This came out, I believe, in the 80s. And I believe Jessie O'Neill has passed on. I can't find her anywhere. But she was one of the first people to talk about the issues of wealth. And, some of them are that people are hostile to you a lot of the time if you're wealthy. They don't like you, and you can't complain because people think you're whining and moaning if you're complaining because you have all this wealth. So you're just, now you have no excuse to not be happy. And yet the truth is, and she was trying to reach out and counsel wealthy people, that there is no guarantee, as Chantal has said, that wealth equals your internal well-being. Perhaps your physical well-being, you can go to better doctors, and these are all important things for people who don't have very much money at all, things that we need to look at and address. But Chantal, do you want to talk about maybe what you see psychologically about the mistake that people are making in their thinking about wealth or power or sex? I mean, we could put in, substitute a lot of different words for wealth in terms of addiction or thinking that this is going to make me happy.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the first thing I want to say is that, wealth isn't the problem. Like, wealth is not the problem. Having money is not the problem. It's like saying, I've got a knife, knives are dangerous. No, a knife is a tool. How you use the tool makes it either dangerous or useful. I can either cut my food with it or I can stab someone with it, right? It's a tool. So there's nothing wrong with being wealthy per se. If someone has a lot of money and they're using that money in a way that they feel is progress in their mind, in a lot of people's minds, the way they're using their money is moving things forwards. It's changing the dial a bit on something. So I think we have to, be really careful about, it's not about, money is not the issue. Wealth is not the issue. It's our relationship with money that is the issue. It's the connection that we have mentally, how we, how we see it symbolically, which is problematic. And I think it fundamentally comes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is insecurity. Because, if you say money is ... and you ask 1,000 people to complete that sentence, money is or money means, and a lot of people will say money means security, money means happiness, money means peace of mind. It'll always come back 9 times out of 10. If you keep asking that question and digging down deep enough, you'll get to a feeling. you'll get to peace of mind,
Yes.
happiness, contentment. You'll get to something like that in the end if you ask the question enough times. And what will that get you? And what will that do for you?
Right.
Okay, and that,
Yeah.
what will that do for you,
Let me,
right?
so it's like, I just want to break this down a little. So if we ask someone, what does money get you? Security, maybe safety. Okay. And then what does that give you? That gives me peace of mind, right? That's what you're speaking to. I'm just giving you
Privacy is a big one. Privacy.
Right.
privacy. Okay.
Yeah, all of those things, right? So, and ultimately, it looks like without that, they can't have peace of mind, they can't have privacy, or they can't have safety, or they can't have, emotional, psychological security, and that's where the problem is. It's not the problem is not having money. I mean, it's a tool and it's really, really useful. The problem is if we psychologically think that money in and of itself has any absolute bearing on our level of psychological well-being, resilience, happiness, then we are, fundamentally, it's like we're in a rabbit hole that has no end. We're going to keep going down that rabbit hole and we're never, it's like, no, you've got to turn around and see what money really is, what it's really doing for you. And I think until people fundamentally recognize that security, look, I want to make a distinction because, money can buy it can buy sanitation, it can buy clean, it can mean that people have clean water so that they don't die of cholera or any other diseases. We need those things. There are fundamental hygiene factors, right, that we need to be safe and secure. We need to be able to eat. We need some basic shelter. But but what people think they need, what we desire is so way above that threshold that most of us in the Western world, at least, are living with way more than we're ever going to need.
That's right.
But all of that is part of the trap of, but if I have that, then I'm going to feel this. When I have that, I feel this. And until we break that until we disconnect that thought trap that, this makes me feel good or not having this makes me feel bad, until we see through that illusion, we're going to stay stuck. Nothing's going to change. I don't think that that what we're talking about here and all of the social injustice and everything else that we're dealing with the climate crisis, I don't think any of that is going to be dealt with until we deal with insecurity, because insecurity creates greed, creates overconsumption, creates withdrawal from society for the need to feel safe. It creates all of that. So we've got to deal with insecurity.
And I would argue that the size of the wealth gap creates that insecurity in society, because it's like wealth from an individual psychological standpoint is not a problem, but the division of wealth in a society is the problem, because when you have politicians going around talking about makers and takers, you have this idea that the farther the rungs of society are spread apart, the more fear that you're not going to be on the right side of that equation, and your children are not going to be on the right side of that equation, which is why you have wealthy people cheating their kids' way to colleges, as there's a trial going on right now in that case. So people say, why would they behave that way? Because they're afraid. They're afraid of their kids not succeeding, and people are afraid of themselves not succeeding. And that, I feel like that insecurity puts in us a desire to hoard resources. And so, like you were talking about, people don't have, they accumulate so much more than they really need, and that's out of fear, I would argue. And then you've got a guy like Jeff Bezos. So I want to correct you, Amy, we don't have trillionaires yet, but he would be he's the most likely to become one.
I thought Elon Musk was a trillionaire already.
No? Some exaggeration. No.
Okay. All right. Well,
Bezos is still, Musk has briefly been the richest guy based on stock bounce, but Bezos is really the top.
Bezos is at the
dog,
top,
right?
Yeah.
And so that may be what, at a certain level, these guys, they want to be number one. It's a big ego thing. It has nothing to do with money. I mean, if you have
it's the game. That's the other piece, is winning at the game.
Winning.
It could be, it could be just, pebbles or marbles or, or something, but getting the most means you win. And that's also a function of, well, psychology and insecurity as well,
Of success, like how do we
Yeah.
define success, right? Like the whole idea of what success is so multifaceted, but also so fundamentally flawed.
Yeah.
because I got a client who said to me today, I've just realized that I'm seeing that I value work and achievement and earnings more than anything else. And she was starting to realize that just was so out of whack, and didn't know that it had almost crept up on her, that she didn't even realize that that's how she valued things, or how she did value things. So I think that a lot of it's very unconscious as well.
Yeah. And there's some innocence there, that we're born into a system and we're constantly bombarded by advertising and the media around, people driving fabulous cars and living in fabulous homes and looking sexier, happier, more fit, in these cars and homes and fabulous hotels or whatever's being sold to us. And seeing through that seems so important. But I want to circle back to what Michael said about the income disparity, at least in the United States, is also generating insecurity. It's kind of like, I know that from our perspective, Chantal and I both work together in 3 Principles Psychology. Everything is thought generated, in the sense of our values are thought generated. What we think is going to bring us happiness is thought generated. And so actually recovering from that isn't that complicated, because we just look at how our thinking has created this. And then there's something deeper inside of us, that is before and beneath our thought systems, our conditioning. But in the world, I want to just add this in, of form and conditioning and physical, I think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which has been, actually, I heard it came from indigenous groups and it should look different. But according to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it is hard for people to sit around meditating when they're starving to death, right? It's hard for them to be contemplating spiritual matters when they're freezing to death out on the street. So I don't want to dismiss how much wealth can mean to some people, and how much, you think that at the top of the pyramid, people who have a lot of wealth would then turn, as in Maslow's pyramid, to self-actualization. Because now they have the opportunity to do so. I love the spiritual teacher Gangaji, because she talks about anyone who's on this call with me, who has the time to be on a webinar with me on a weekday or even on a weekend, and is fully fed and clothed and sheltered, has tremendous privilege. And that's a piece, I think, that people who are caught up in the game of wealth innocently, in a sense, they don't take even a moment to appreciate what they already have. And we all do this. We want to have children, and then we stop. We forget that we wanted to have children, and we're worried about how to get them out the door into college and successful. And we forget about enjoying the children. We wanted to have this fabulous home, and we're not even enjoying it because we're on to, the second home in Jamaica or the Bahamas or whatever. So, but I don't want to, there's the psychology piece. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, and also in the US, where we have so much wealth, I think we are still the wealthiest nation on earth. Our tax codes have been changing over the years, and Michael knows a lot about this, to the point where very wealthy people are no longer contributing. And I see that as an issue, because our society is reflecting the insecurity and the greed, which comes from insecurity, to the point of people are dying on the streets now. You'd be shocked, Chantal, to see what we have going on everywhere you look around the freeways, in the worst possible places that anyone would want to live or be. You have tent encampments and clothes and piles of garbage and people just trying to survive here. It's shocking. It's shocking to me. I don't know, Michael, it seems to me that if we put money into programs for low-income housing, we could do so many things with that money. We need mental health treatment. We need addiction treatment. We need low-income housing.
we need all sorts of things, but
Yeah.
there's such a powerful constituency that is just forever pushing against any rise in taxes or the way the tax system is structured, what gets taxed versus what doesn't get taxed.
Yeah.
And that's really where, if you talk about sort of just the taxes we do pay,
Yeah.
it's not that wealthy people don't contribute. I mean, they do pay a lot of taxes, but it actually goes down at the very high end. Like the 400 richest people in America pay a lower tax rate than the bottom 10%. I mean, there's sort of almost a flat tax if you can combine all taxes. It's about 28%. Kind of goes up in the 1%, and goes down again at the very billionaire level. But the thing is really more important is what is not being taxed. And what's not being taxed is the wealth these people are accumulating. They're taxed mostly on income, and super wealthy people have actually figured out how to avoid income. They just borrow against their capital holdings. And when you
At very low interest rates, yeah.
Right, when you're super wealthy, people practically throw money at you. Banks will just they will give you giant loans.
Yeah.
And you can live off those, 5, 6, 7% interest, as opposed to paying the top tax rate of 37%. Like, who wouldn't do it, right?
Right.
We can save you, 30% on your taxes by taking this loan. And then the loan comes due, you just get another loan to pay for that loan. It's like borrow, die. I don't know, Republic had a funny way of stating it. But, and the thing that this does is it sucks all the money out of the public coffers. It's really insidious. We were talking about climate change. I looked at an article today on The Guardian. It said $11 million per minute goes to subsidize the fossil fuel industry, like from government expenditures. $11 million a minute. And where's that money coming from?
Yeah, I've been thinking about how people probably saw energy as a wonderful way to make excuse my French, shit ton of money. I hope I can say that on YouTube. Maybe we can beep it out.
Yes, you can.
Yeah, because it's a monopoly on what everybody needs when you own an energy company. It's a near monopoly on what everybody needs power at this point. We're all so reliant on it. And I just want to mention something that's in Michael's book, Jackpot, also about the tax codes and the amount of auditing that's done on the very wealthy has shrunk from, it was like 25% of what very wealthy people in the tens of millions of dollars in income would be audited. And the Republicans have really chipped away at the IRS budget. So it's very, very small, along with the budgets for like NOAA and Fish and Wildlife and all these other, health and human services, these agencies that take care of us, right? But at any rate, the IRS budget has been chipped away at, so it's something like 0.02% now of people are being audited at that level. Is that right?
It's 23% at its peak, and then it went down to 0.03.
0.03%.
Yeah.
That's so. If we're not even having audits, then who knows? Even if we did have a tax code that was more equitable, people could still sort of cheat and assume that they probably won't get audited
and they do. They do. I mean, even like people who don't bother filing their taxes, they're really swayed towards the very wealthy.
Yeah.
Some people just don't pay their taxes.
Yeah. It's
and
all
so,
in
like,
here.
Come after me,
It's all in here, folks. Read this book.
Yeah, please do.
What?
Please do.
Yeah, please do. Please do. And getting back to, I mean, what occurs to me, Chantal and Michael, feel free to chime in if you'd like to, is that, again, we have created from our thoughts a system, because all systems come from someone's thinking to set it up, that now owns us to the point of like planetary suicide. We can't even break away from it enough to see what's happening, to us as a society. I mean, one of the things I've always believed is that we are connected in human consciousness. And so when we see people on the streets without homes, it affects us. It can't help but affect us, because we all have, most of us, unless you're a total sociopath, we get affected by it because we have compassion, and then that can generate either I want to go help and try to fix it, or a kind of denialism, like if I just say that these people are lazy and criminal and drug addicts and they don't deserve anything, then I can rest my mind, by creating this kind of thinking about the situation. But ultimately, anything that we have thought up, we could potentially change, and it would take the power of an insight. And an insight, from my perspective, is a deeper kind of thinking that comes from within, from our own deeper wisdom and sense of connection to each other and to, life on Earth. Chantal, what are your thoughts about how we could go about helping people understand where their well-being actually comes from?
Well, yeah, it sounds so obvious, but we have to start having these kinds of dialogues more openly. We have to start having conversations about our relationship with money, what it means to us. There just needs to be more discourse apart from anything else. Obviously, education, it's always going to be about education, but those of us that have relationships with people who are in wealth creation jobs or who have wealth, we need to be having these conversations, the kind of conversations that Michael's been having in the interviews he's been doing for his book. We need to be dialoguing about this. And because it's not like people don't know. If I think about the number of clients, the number of people I've spoken to over the last 20 years who have an inordinate, amount of wealth, in a traditional sense, money, financial wealth, and yet say, but why am I not happy? And they feel guilty because they say, on paper I've got everything, but I'm depressed and I feel guilty. I feel guilty even saying that I feel depressed, because how do I have the right to be depressed? Because I've got everything. And so then they don't talk about their mental health issues because they think that, they don't deserve, to be heard. So again, it's such a toxic relationship we have in terms of our relationship with money. So we have to have these kinds of conversations. We have to, it needs to just become, the fact that even the fact that people were reluctant to speak to you, Michael, it just shows this kind of taboo. Like, we're only just starting to talk about the menopause. There's lots of things, mental health, we're breaking through some of the taboos of mental health. Well, maybe this is a taboo we have to sort of break through. Maybe this is something we have to call out, and say, why wouldn't people feel comfortable talking to you about, what is it that they were really fearful of talking to you about it? I think so part of it is just starting to have these conversations where we can bring the spiritual dimension of the human experience into our relationship with money. To say, let's talk about our relationship with money. Let's talk about our relationship with wealth. Let's really understand money for what purpose. What is it buying us? What is it doing for us? Let's talk about that more, and then we can back it into the psychological domain. But I think it's discourse. I think it's education. I think it's that's part of it.
Isn't it interesting that in some ways we have so much desire to accumulate wealth, and yet then we feel embarrassed or guilty about it? It's a real disconnect, right? Why would we want this if then it's going to make us feel embarrassed? I feel like there's good guilt and bad guilt. There's crippling, paralyzing guilt that doesn't do anybody any good. And there's guilt put to a purpose, which is, like Amy was saying, some kind of self-actualization, or better yet, helping others and creating connections with others. So there's a guy in my book, a guy named Doug Holliday, who was a former, diplomat, former Wall Street guy, but he was always kind of spiritually minded. He ended up starting a nonprofit called Path North. What Path North does is gets these extraordinarily wealthy people, almost all men, I think it's all men, male CEOs, senators, very prominent people, and he takes them on these sort of disruptive experiences, these trips, and it's very luxurious. They eat very well, they meet at their black tie dinners and hash through these issues. And I mean, it's very, you know, a weird kind of like wealthy, clubby self-actualization, but it does kind of create a conversation even among that crowd about these things. Because he says, you know, these guys are people who have worked their whole life in search of creating a personal brand for themselves. And he says they're lost. They're emotionally, spiritually empty. And they're so desperate. But that's a very small minority of these wealthy people who actually come to him. He says, you know, there's a lot of people who would never do something like this. But then there's a sort of a simpler solution. And, you know, I talked to a guy who was a CEO of a big, he's president of a big tech company that went public in the first dot-com boom, and he landed an incredible amount of money. And he was telling me about volunteering for a conservation group and just having out there, he just, you know, doing some trail maintenance or something, and having a conversation with this young guy who was having trouble affording an apartment, and it was just they were just having a very normal conversation. He says, I can't tell you how refreshing it was to hear someone talk about normal things. And the fact that that was so weird to him shows you how much we dissociate ourselves. The people who seem to do best with like philanthropy instead of just giving a bunch of money to someone and keep living in your bubble, there's people who get involved personally and who actually work on the ground with people and get to know people that aren't like them and that have different problems than them, and let them know each other and empathize with each other and say, oh, this rich person's not so terrible, and that poor person is actually really hardworking and deserving, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Just have some kind of dialogue and an exchange of ideas and thoughts and our separate realities. And in some ways, I want to point out that the rest of the population, maybe people who aren't as wealthy, people like at my level and below, let's say, we help to perpetuate the whole system by you know, idolizing wealth, you know, and thinking. There's a term that you have in your book, I think it's called wealth optimism or mobility optimism, where people in the United States are constantly fed this line that you can make it, you can make it, you can make it, even when the conditions around them are getting worse or getting harder to deal with. And one of the things that struck me during the pandemic, I think it was when the pandemic first hit, and we were looking at who can survive without their jobs right now. And there was some statistic about half the US population cannot afford a $400 or $500 emergency right now, you know, like half the US population. So that is something clearly that needs to be fixed. It won't be fixed if we can't look at the systems that we're living in, how they were created, and think about how to change them. I also wanted to just mention something about state of mind, because I think it's so important that if for everyone who's listening to this and watching this video, state of mind is something you can have a moment of peace and fulfillment and gratitude anywhere at any time. You know, it's a state of mind. And that's, I think, what we forget, not just in the pursuit of wealth, but even in pursuit of our career, our goals, or whatever we've got on the table in terms of time, and thinking about time and what we can achieve in time. And I think all the great mystics would say, actually, and this is, I think, what they mean when they say happiness is inside of you and you are already enlightened. You know, they say all these different things. And what I noticed for myself is that when I slow down my thinking and I'm not thinking in such a goal-oriented manner about the future all the time or about the past, that's when I find those feelings that people think they're going to get from the money. So I think if we can share that message in whatever form, whether through 3 principles, and there are people out there doing all kinds of mindfulness work and all kinds of stuff, then we're better off. And I just want to ask for any last thoughts, because we're going to need to sign off here, but any last comments or thoughts?
I mean, I just want to say that I think that what Michael said earlier is really important, which is we have to do something about the disproportionate, the disproportionality in terms of where the wealth is. I think, is it like the top 5 people own the equivalent of half the wealth of the whole population or something of the world? I don't know what the statistic is. There's something, Michael, you probably know what that is, but the fact is it is disproportionate. So yes, it is important if you're somebody that feels like you don't have enough to be able to know that well-being is there, but actually you've got to be able to eat, you've got to have, you've got to feel safe in the building that you've got to be sleeping somewhere safe, and all of those fundamental things are fundamental human rights. And so there is a social injustice issue here to be addressed. But unfortunately, if a lot of the people that are in charge of the policies and the systems that are going to make those changes are part of that, have their own insecurities, then that's going to perpetuate the issue. So, in our community work, one of my intentions is to try and bring as much psychological emotional psychological resilience to those people in positions of power and influence that are making decisions, that are challenging policies. Because if they feel secure within themselves, and if they understand a little bit more about where their well-being is actually coming from, and they can start to see that deeper spiritual truth for themselves at whatever level, it's going to impact the kinds of conversations that they're having. So I think that, for me, that's very important, is that who are we having these conversations with? Where does this education and this transformation need to happen? And it's not with the poorest people in the world, it's with those that are holding the wealth and the power to make the changes at a policy level and at an investment level that we need.
Yeah,
that's precisely what I kind of the conclusion I come to. And I've had people say, in fact, like the New York Times reviewed the book, and the reviewer got a little bit hung up on the fact that I was saying that we should think about the wealthy from a position of empathy. And people, and there was like one Amazon review said mechanic is a sycophant to the rich, and other people had the opposite view. I mean, it was silly, but my point was that you can't change the system without changing the minds of the people who control the system. And there was a lot of hope with the pandemic and the protests over the murder of George Floyd and so forth, but there was some kind of reckoning and some kind of awakening in the minds of some very wealthy people, and there was for some. The trouble is that the system kind of perpetuates itself, the system of lobbying by businesses and so on, just like the example I use of the corporate roundtable, saying this like feel good stuff over here and then acting the other way. You see that with corporate America all the time. Oil companies to say, we're going to go to net zero by 2050, but meanwhile they're lobbying, whatever.
Yeah.
So you get this.
Meanwhile, they're calling Joe Manchin every week.
Exactly. So you get well-intentioned people with wealth out there, but unless they are actually actively trying to change the system, it's not going to change.
Yeah. So we need the wealthy people to be engaged. And I just want to mention Chantal Burns. She's in the UK. She runs the Conscious Leadership School. Chantal, is that at chantalburns.com, or is there another website for that?
Yeah, chantalburns.com and consciousleadershipschool.com.
Yeah. And I was a part of that program as an instructor. It was an amazing, fabulous program. Chantal's she just takes care of every detail for everybody. So even the wealthy people will feel quite at home because they will be taken care of. And then I'm in Northern California. I'm at amychen.com. That's AMICHEN.com. I also do consulting and training and working with individuals toward their innate resiliency, their deeper wisdom, and especially around engaging in our current issues, including climate, and including the income gap, the things that are just sort of glaring at us right now. Michael Mechanic is the author of this book, Jackpot, and you can buy this at most major bookstores and online, how the super rich really live and how their wealth harms us all. Also a senior editor at Mother Jones Magazine.
And I have a website too.
And he has a website too. What's your website?
It's either my name, Michael Mechanic, or readjackpot.com.
Okay, cool. Readjackpot.com or
That's
Michael.
Easy.
Yeah.
Easier to
Or,
spell.
yeah, or Michael Mechanic. That's a cool name. Okay,
Yeah.
those are, you can remember
And
those.
there's, you know, I have a blog on there. I have all the reviews of the book and so forth. You can
Yeah.
get a better feel for it.
Yeah, thank you. And you know what? Chantal was talking about how having these conversations, bringing the topic to the fore. I mean, we have lots of colleagues who work with wealthy people and corporations, but the conversation is about productivity and efficiency and teamwork and how to make your company more profitable and maybe a healthier culture. Incidentally, that might trigger some thoughts in leadership, but I believe we need to start to address this topic more directly because of the times that we're in and how much of a crisis we're in around democracy, climate, income disparity, you know, everything. So I want to thank you guys for having the dialogue, bringing it forward with me. It'll be out on YouTube soon. And I want to thank everyone who's watching for watching and for listening. And we will see you with the next episode. And please make sure you subscribe below and comment. And have a wonderful day. We'll see you on the flip side.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Michael.
Bye, guys.